There's a village called Harmonia that used to exist 6 miles west of Battle Creek. All that remains is a forgotten cemetery of the people that lived here. Soujourner Truth actually lived here for a short period of time, but didn't find it to her liking, so she moved to Battle Creek. Her daughter, however, and her son-in-law lived here for 30 years. The village no longer exists, but today I'm going to explore and try to find what remains of the Harmonia Cemetery and some of the forgotten history of the Village of Harmonia. So come along and join me.
The Village of Harmonia was established by Quaker pioneers who had converted to Spiritualism, a religious movement that believed spirits of the dead existed and could communicate with the living. The Spiritualist movement began in 1848 when two sisters, Kate and Margaretta Fox of Hydesville, New York, claimed to have made contact with a spirit through a series of rapping noises. A third sister, Leah, took charge of them and began managing their careers, holding public demonstrations of their methods. The girls at the time, aged 15 and 11, quickly became the first celebrity mediums known for their public seances. Spiritualism soon became a belief system that swept across the country in the years prior to and during the Civil War. It was likely those beliefs that attracted Quaker pioneer Reynolds Cornell and his family to spiritualism. In 1850, he and his wife Dorcas paid $924 for 230 acres of land on the Bedford Plain just south of the Kalamazoo River, later established as the Village of Harmonia. The land wasn't officially platted until 1855 when the Cornells enlisted the help of John Meacham, whom I featured details of in some of my other videos. John Meacham helped them plat the land into 140 one-acre lots, which were defined and made available. The name Harmonia derived from a spiritualist doctrine that emphasized the harmonious relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. According to Bernice Bryant Lowe in her book Tales of Battle Creek, much of the mystery surrounding Harmonia had to do with a private school organized by Reynolds Cornell and managed and taught by his son, Hiram Cornell. A description of the school appeared in an advertisement in the Battle Creek Journal in 1856, referring to it as the Bedford Harmonial Institute. The institute had many other descriptive names over the years. It was called the Agricultural, the Seminary, and the Academy at various times. The Cornells were Quakers turned spiritualists. Just when their conversion occurred is not known. The building the institute was housed in was constructed by the Cornells and was nicknamed the Bandbox due to its awkward size of 4 stories. The upper floors built as dormitories to house boarding students. The upper 2 floors were blown away in a tornado on August 4, 1862. A roof was then placed over the intact 2 stories, and instruction continued. The anti-slavery worker Jonathan Walker visited the Cornells in 1852 and spoke at the school, and described it as being taught on broad principles. Walker was an American reformer who became a national hero in the abolitionist movement in 1844 when he was trialed and sentenced as a slave stealer following his attempt to help 7 runaway slaves find freedom. He was branded on his hand by the U.S. government with the markings SS for slave stealer. When Walker visited the Harmonia Institute, he was treated to some interesting table tappings and rappings. The following year, Parker Pillsbury came to visit. He was an American minister who was active in writing and lecturing for the abolitionist movement and a progressive campaigner for women's rights. His take on the Harmonia Institute was quite different. He was a bit disgusted with the spiritualistic overtones at the school that was publicized as being non-sectarian. It was in July 1857 that the most famous resident of Harmonia purchased a lot in a house there and that was Soujourner Truth. She is the well-known former slave who was an American abolitionist and women's rights activist, whom I've covered in some of my other videos. The 1857 map shows a schoolhouse, presumably a public school, about a half a mile from her house, and a seminary almost next door to her. The Cornells were her neighbors. The 1860 census taken in June showed that her grandson Samuel Banks, age 9, attended school there. Soujourner didn't enjoy life in Harmonia and moved to Battle Creek in 1867. Her daughter Sophia and her husband Thomas Schuyler and 4 sons subsequently occupied Soujourner's Harmonia house for nearly 30 years. The Cornell family left Harmonia in 1863 and moved to Nebraska and never returned. Reynolds Cornell passed away in 1876 at the age of 82. He is buried at the Warner Cemetery in Syracuse, Nebraska. Life continued on in Harmonia until about the turn of the century and a little bit thereafter. There was a lot of pleasant interaction between Harmonia and Battle Creek, and it was frequently visited by Battle Creek residents over the years. Many notices showed up in newspapers about a lot of social gatherings, political speeches, and even a lot of temperance meetings. Spiritualism in the United States reached its membership peaks between the 1840s to the 1920s, especially in English-speaking countries around the world. By 1897, spiritualism was said to have more than 8 million followers in the United States and Europe, mostly drawn from middle and upper classes. Over the years, it had its believers and its many skeptics. Despite numerous instances of chicanery, the appeal of spiritualism was strong. Many families during the time of the American Civil War had seen their men go off and never return, and images of the battlefield produced through the new medium of photography demonstrated that their loved ones had not only died in overwhelmingly huge numbers, but also horribly as well. One well-known case is that of Mary Todd Lincoln, who, in grieving the loss of her son, organized seances at the White House, which were even attended by her husband, President Abraham Lincoln. The surge of spiritualism during that time and even later in World War I was often said to be a direct response to those massive battlefield casualties. The arrival of Quaker settlers and later spiritualists to the Battle Creek area predated the founding of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is largely credited with seeding the ground for the health reform movement that led to the cereal boom at the turn of the century, which put Battle Creek on the map. However, the Adventists and the spiritualists were not necessarily close friends. Part of the reason was you have Ellen G. White, who was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist religion, who had revelations in trances. And she was sometimes accused of practicing a form of spiritualism, so she rejected that idea and saw spiritualism as sort of a negative. However, the two groups, the Adventists and the spiritualists, did share some common beliefs on health reform, diet, hydrotherapy, temperance, and the Quakers also came to the community and were very interested in anti-slavery and women's rights. So you have some degree a commonality on spirituality, but a different take on a few points of it. So it attracted people that were more open to this sort of thinking and brought about more of a religious tolerance in the community. Today you can find the cemetery located on a hill by following a road that was once known as Cemetery Hill Road. It overlooks in the distance a forgotten ghost village once called Harmonia, a one-time utopian community. Over the years, Harmonia has taken on a mystic quality in local folklore with its unusual history. Now let's explore just a few of the stories of some of its former residents who are buried here. Sophia Schuyler was one of the daughters of Soujourner Truth, who, along with her mother, had been born into slavery in the state of New York before it had been abolished there. She lived with her family in Harmonia for 30 years in the house that her mother had left behind. She died at the age of 80. However, the newspaper account at the time erroneously stated she was 75. Her grave was left unmarked for many years until a great-grandson discovered her history and paid to have her headstone installed around 2014. John Forshay was born in Ravenna, Ohio, and married his wife Susan Abbey in 1830. The family spent some time in Indiana before moving to Kalamazoo, and they were members of the Methodist Church, which had arrived in the village of Harmonia in 1873. John was described in a short biography by his grandson as a man of broad mind and excellent ability, who took a prominent part in public affairs and was well known in the section in which he resided. He died in 1895, and Susan died a year prior at the age of 85. They had 11 children, and 8 were still alive at the time of her death. Henry Adrian, at the age of 20 years old, had enlisted in the military at Lockport, Niagara, New York, when the Civil War broke out. He served with Company G, 7th Cavalry Regiment, New York, from September 1861 to March 1862. Upon returning from military service, he moved from New York to Calhoun County and purchased a farm in the Harmonia area. He married Mary Krapoff in 1864, and over the years they had 9 children. Henry died at a young age of 51 years old, suddenly, from what appears to have been a heart attack while he was chopping wood on his farm. William Henry Sampson owned a fruit farm in Harmonia and lived in a house in Battle Creek. He met a widow named Elizabeth Nodder, and they fell in love. On the day of their wedding, another man named Albert Whitcomb showed up, who had employed Elizabeth as a housekeeper. He was irate about the wedding and demanded to see her, as he wanted to stop it. Apparently, he was jealous and wanted her for himself. She refused to see him, and so William came to the door and asked him to leave. Upon seeing William, Albert pulled 2 pistols out of his pockets and shot William several times. Elizabeth heard the commotion and came running down the hall, and Albert shot her also, and then turned the gun on himself. William and Albert died within hours, and only Elizabeth recovered. A very sad story indeed. Contrary to the mysticism of its spiritualist founding, from what I was able to research, most of the people buried at the Harmonia Cemetery were a blend of Methodist, Presbyterian, and Quaker faiths, with no mention of the beliefs of the Cornells in their obituaries. The Bedford Harmonial Seminary/Institute had disbanded in 1860. However, the community remained integrated for many years, starting prior to the Civil War, which was unusual and quite progressive for the time due to the prominent abolitionist beliefs. The tornado that had rolled through the village in 1862 had all but put an end to the community. By 1910, there were only a few people living in the village. Most of the people living in the area were farmers. With the outbreak of the Great War, recorded in present-day history as World War I, the village site of Harmonia was acquired in the project to build Camp Custer and turn into barracks for troops in an $8 million federal project at the time. All of the buildings in the village were torn down in 1917, with the exception of the old Harmonia School, where peace and acceptance had been taught for so many years, which was converted into an automatic rifle school during the war. In an article from July 6, 1917, it defines the location on the map where the barracks would be built. It states, "On the east side of the road leading from Harmonia north to Cemetery Hill lies the west half of Section 32. Then it goes on to describe the land being owned by Stewart, Cotton, Brown, Morris, and Jenkins. Then in Section 5 as the land owned by Stoddard, Morse, Huber, and Orns." When I was exploring a clearing just south of the cemetery off of Old Cemetery Road when filming this, in Section 32 in the parcel that was indicated as Stewart in this 1916 atlas. There's a lot of remnants of old pieces of wood laying in the prairie area that show paint on one side, and it looks like very old wood, and I believe these are remnants of the old barracks that no longer exist. You probably would like to know at this point where the village of Harmonia stood in context to present day. If you notice on this map, the village lies on the boundary line between sections 31, 32 of Bedford Township and sections 5 and 6 of Battle Creek Township. Now, the township boundary lines are different today, and Battle Creek Township is now part of the city of Battle Creek. However, the county grid lines remain the same. So, looking at the present day map with the grid lines in place, I have placed a yellow circle on the grid numbers and indicated a green square where the cemetery location is. The grid line running south from the cemetery is what was Cemetery Hill Road from 1894 to 1916. The blue line indicates present-day Harmonia Road, which ends just before the Fort Custer industrial area, but begins again and continues on inside the Fort Custer base as we know it today. The purple rectangle represents where the village of Harmonia once stood, which is now in the parking lot of Denso Manufacturing. In Tales of Battle Creek, which was published in 1976, Bernice Bryant Lowe describes Harmonia road signs westward from Helmer Road and a forgotten cemetery hugging the side of a hill are all that can be found to recall the Quakers turned spiritualists, and the integrated community that hoped for greatness through education. The Custer barracks that replaced it are also gone. A west wind uninterrupted by trees or buildings sweeps across a level plain. Since the publishing of her book, the Fort Custer industrial area has been developed on this flat plain site, which used to be the village of Harmonia and the surrounding farms in the community. There was a very informative article written in 2019 by Nick Buckley of the Battle Creek Inquirer that was very helpful to me in researching the village of Harmonia, and I just wanted to include a section of a timeline that's included in the article, which I found to be fairly consistent with the other sources that I researched in creating this video. I'll include a link to Nick Buckley's article in this video's description for those that are interested in reading it. It's a very well done article and worth the time. It shows you that 1850 the Cornell family purchases the land, 1852 Bedford Harmonial Seminary / Institute opens, 1855 land officially platted, 1856 to 57 Soujourner Truth purchases land, 1860 Bedford Harmonial Seminary Institute disbands, 1862 tornado destroys most of village, and 1863 Cornell family moves to Nebraska, 1867 Soujourner Truth moves to 38 College Street in Battle Creek, and by 1917 Camp Custer is built on the former Harmonia site.
Well, that's going to do it for today's journey through the history of the village of Harmonia and its forgotten cemetery here in Bedford Township. If you liked today's video, please take a minute, leave me a like, leave me a comment, tell me what you thought, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.